This is when the fun starts.
Trust me.
All right, let's get started.
I go to America!
You ready for an adventure?
Let's go!
2023 on Disney Plus. It's going to be quite a year.
Hey, Apple. Call me.
Hey, welcome to About That. I'm Kieran Oudshoorn sitting in for Andrew Chang. And odds are you probably use at least one of these services. And today we're talking about something that could impact the kind of content they create and the kind of content you see. I'm talking about Bill C-11, the Online Streaming Act, and you may have heard of it. It's a bill that stands to update Canada's laws around broadcasting for the first time in the internet age. It calls for more regulations of streaming services here in Canada. Essentially, the argument is if you want Canadian eyes on your content, to pay subscriptions, to watch ads, then there needs to be more give and take. Because right now, foreign services like YouTube, Netflix, Spotify, and Disney Plus, they're all earning money in Canada, but they're not required to reinvest in Canadian content, meaning they're not obligated to fund productions in Canada or tell stories about Canada. But this bill, well, it would change that. So why are we talking about all of this right now? Well, Bill C-11 is well on its way to becoming law, and there's been some interesting developments. And while the bill has changed over time, there's still a lot of criticism, and we'll get to that. But in February, the bill, it passed third reading in the Senate, with the upper house tacking on 26 amendments, in particular around how the law will deal with user-generated content, or in other words, the stuff that people create on TikTok and YouTube every day.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals don't want to hear the truth, and the truth is that Conservatives are the ones standing up for digital-first creators. It's Conservatives who are standing up for free expression online so that new technology, new experiences can be used and explored not only here in Canada, but find success around the globe.
So obviously there are a lot of people that could be affected by this. Now the bill is back over to the House of Commons right now, which is going to decide on which of those amendments they're going to be keeping and which ones they're not. Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez says he intends to reject several of the Senate's amendments that he says don't align with what he thinks is the spirit of the bill. Quote, as promised, we are accepting amendments that ensure tech giants pay their fair share towards our culture, and we are declining the amendments that create loopholes. But it's still not clear how many of those amendments will be accepted or adjusted. So it's hard to say exactly how the content we watch could be affected. On top of that, much of the language of the bill is going to be left up to the CRTC to interpret. So another unknown that makes it tough to gauge how this could all end up. What we do have a good read on, though, is how this bill is being received.
Billion-dollar companies who have effectively been crashing on our cultural couch for almost a decade, paying nothing towards the structures and systems that allow Canadians to tell their own stories. With the adoption of Bill C-11, we as a country will finally send a long overdue notice to these foreign tech giants that their rent is due.
But the bill, it also has its critics.
The Liberals are actually changing what Canadians see online without debate and behind closed doors. It is clear from expert testimony that this bill will allow CRTC to regulate user-generated content.
By this point, I think that most of my regular viewers are at least somewhat aware of Canada's Bill C-11 and are probably also aware that it is something that I am pretty firmly against.
Today I hope to teach the committee about Canada's vast YouTuber community and why so many of us fear Bill C-11, a bill we did not ask for, do not need, and threatens the success we've already achieved.
So here we have people on both sides of this argument. Advocates saying, hey, it's not fair. We're all creating content. Everyone should have to play by the same rules. Plus, this places a value on Canadian stories and the roles of Canadians in creating content. So that includes American productions that are done on Canadian soil. But on the other hand, the critics are saying, hey, not so fast. We shouldn't have to play by all the same rules because we're not playing the same game. They say the government is overreaching here and that no one should be telling them what they should create. And of course, up until now, no one really has. So the question that we are posing today when it comes to Canadian content is, will more rules hurt or help? Let's get into a quick backstory here on what's at the heart of what we're talking about. The rules that all the traditional broadcasters have had to play for the past 55 years. Now, in 1968, the Broadcasting Act was updated to create the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, or CRTC. It oversees things like the kind of content radio and television stations are broadcasting, and how much national and local programming there is. And, of course, the role and responsibilities of organizations like the CBC. And the last time the Broadcasting Act was updated in 1991, around the time this happened.
In 1989, Tim Berners-Lee invents the World Wide Web at the CERN Physics Laboratory in Switzerland, providing a standard for different networks of connected computers to interact.
Now, that was more than 30 years ago, and of course, no streaming services existed back then. But fast forward to now, and these internet broadcasting platforms, they are unregulated. And that means they don't have to carry Canadian content, or tell Canadian stories, or use Canadian workers. So, now, joining me here to help break all this down and the latest is Josh O'Kane. He is a reporter with the Globe and Mail, reporting on arts. Josh, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Kieran.
Okay, so starting with this topic, I kind of want to start at the beginning in terms of looking at, we've laid out sort of like some of the positions that people are taking, but from what you're hearing, why is this bill so controversial?
If you take a bit of a step back and you look at where Canada sees itself in the world, Canada is a small country right next to the United States. There's been a longstanding fear for many decades among the sort of private creative industries in the country for trying to make sure that their content gets surfaced, that doesn't get drowned out. And it kind of comes down to the very basic argument of a free market of content versus government intervention in content. And there were many debates going back to nearly 100 years, since broadcasting became a thing, going into people's homes as to how can we make sure that Canadians are receiving Canadian content so that Canadian creators, writers, artists, filmmakers are able to get their stuff in front of eyeballs so that they're not drowned out. And so, Canadian content rules, came in sort of in an official capacity really under the Pierre Trudeau government. The Broadcasting Act was last updated in 1991. And then this thing called the internet came out and just kind of shattered everything. In a traditional way of broadcasting, it was easy for the Canadian government and the CRTC to basically say, like, listen, you are mandated to have a certain amount of Canadian content, or Canadian content will be decided by if you have X number of people who are a part of your filmmaking project. That changes with streaming because we're in a globalized environment. People everywhere can access content from everywhere. And how do you protect Canadian content in that environment? And this is what has people in the creative industries, screenwriters, and producers, a lot of musicians are, kind of scared that they're going to be drowned out by what the most popular stuff being shipped from around the world, in particular the United States, is going to do to access to their music.
And that they're already being drowned out.
They are already being drowned out to a certain degree. I mean, like, it was, when the film Blackberry, as an example, debuted at the Berlinale last month.
What do you call it?
It's called a Blackberry.
Huh. Try typing with your thumbs.
It was considered an enormous victory for Canadian cinema because it is quite, rare for such a celebrated film to receive such a, a great standing there.
So I'm curious, you mentioned a number of stakeholders here, people who are actors, people who are screenwriters, who are sort of involved in these creative industries. Maybe you can talk to me a little bit about what you're hearing from them and how they're impacted or potentially impacted by this bill.
Yeah, so it's a twofold answer. One is that even when this bill passes, we don't know what the final language is going to be. And even when we do learn what the final language is, it's going to be up to the CRTC to decide what the actual rules look like. But the way that the law is currently written at the time of we are taping this, because Lord knows it keeps changing, there are a number of sort of contentious sort of pieces of language in there. Film producers, as an example, and screenwriters are quite concerned that there's language, I believe it's section 311, that really will delineates different sort of standards for Canadian digital broadcasters and non-Canadian digital broadcasters, that they will be held to a different standard, and so that there might be less incentive for studios or streamers that are working in Canada to then give back to the Canadian industry.
Right.
There are other pieces of language. The other one that's really kind of contentious and has been up in the air for months really is the Senate put forward an amendment to the original language of the bill that went through the House that really tried to firm up language saying this will not affect user-generated content. Because
and by user-generated content, we mean like everything you post on Facebook and YouTube, or
yeah, but that's sort of almost an old school way of thinking about it, right? Like we have people who are professional content creators all throughout Canada, all throughout the world, who are making a living on TikTok and YouTube in particular, doing video content and really serving audiences in new ways that consumers find very relatable. These are normal people who have made their lives part of this. That's it's user-generated content. People make their livelihoods out of this, and they have made their livelihoods in a much less regulated world than what might be proposed by the Canadian government. And there is a lot of concern among content creators that they might have to fill out forms guaranteeing that everything they post is Canadian content. We don't know what that looks like, but that's a major, major concern. There are concerns that if people don't like it, then they might downvote them. And that might affect their place in the algorithm, not just in Canada, but elsewhere, so that people who are being force-fed something and don't like it might actually prevent people who want to see a content creator's video in Iowa might not be able to see it because some weird intervention in the algorithm might actually, downplay them entirely. So people are very concerned about how this bill could be interpreted, and we're not really sure what it will look like because right now the House has basically said, we are going to reject that Senate amendment, but the Senate has said, well, actually, that's basically firming up what you've kind of already promised in between the lines, but didn't put in as strong language.
Right.
And so because they're fighting, we don't know what that looks like. And so there's just a great deal of uncertainty about what the future of Canadian content is and the future of what people are going to be able to watch is.
Right. And this is as you were describing, this is people's livelihoods. This is
people's livelihoods. These are not just content creators, but like traditional screenwriters. Film and TV producers as well, musicians in particular, yeah.
So one of the concerns that I hear raised sometimes is that these sort of these requirements that a certain amount of content be Canadian content sometimes leads to pretty mid content being produced out there. I'm curious if anything in this bill sort of addresses that concern. I mean, obviously, I think people can generally get behind the idea of wanting to have more Canadian content, available to Canadians. But then, are we just supporting material that isn't as strong?
I mean, that is a bit of a subjective value judgment. What I will say is that this has been a problem for many years. I mean, Bryan Adams in the early 90s got very mad at Canadian content rules because he made a record outside of Canada that did not actually fit within the rules, and the rules had to be adjusted in order to accommodate that. But then people going back into the 70s and 80s were complaining. Like Gordon Lightfoot, as a musician, complained that he was being overplayed on Canadian radio and that people were getting tired of him. And I wouldn't call his content mid. This is Gordon Lightfoot we're talking about. But it kind of just shows that when you have this kind of intervention, very few people are going to be 100% happy.
Yeah.
And this is kind of what happens when you kind of take a sort of age-old debate of free market versus government intervention, and you apply it to an extremely subjective, extremely creative industry.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, look, there's obviously a lot that still needs to be unpacked here as this law actually comes into effect, gets passed. But thanks so much for coming in and explaining it to us.
Happy to. Thanks for having me.
For some of these kids, many of them, the majority of them, these are going to be the last basketball games they play at a high level forever. So you see the tears on the sidelines when they lose, and not just tears from them. There's always a shot of cheerleaders crying, little kids crying,